You probably think Apollo was the Greek god of the sun. He wasn't, not originally. The actual sun god was someone else entirely, and his father, a Titan named Hyperion, represented something even bigger, light itself, before it ever had a shape. Hyperion was one of the original 12 Titans, son of Uranos and Gaia. His name translates roughly to the High One, or he who watches from above. And, true to that name, ancient sources associate him less with any specific action or story, and more with an entire domain, celestial light itself, the fundamental brightness that exists before it's divided into anything more specific. Hesiod's Theogony lists him among the 12 almost in passing, giving him none of the drama reserved for siblings like Kronos, a structural placement rather than a character introduction, which turns out to describe his entire mythology in miniature. Hyperion married his sister Thea, herself a Titaness associated with sight and shining radiance. The poet Pindar specifically credits Thea with the reason gold and silver are valued above other metals, describing her as the one who gave them their particular gleam and worth in human eyes, meaning even a Titaness, with relatively little individual mythology of her own, still left a fingerprint on how the ancient world understood brilliance and value together. Hyperion and Thea had 3 children who would go on to define how the ancient Greeks understood the sky: Helios, god of the sun; Selene, goddess of the moon; and Eos, goddess of the dawn. Ancient sources sometimes referred to this trio collectively as the Shining Ones, the specific, visible expressions of the abstract light their parents personified more generally. Before the sun god's true identity gets revealed, and it isn't who you think, take a second to like and subscribe. Here's where the myth-busting really matters. Apollo, whose own episode is still ahead on this channel, is popularly remembered today as the Greek sun god. But in the earliest and most authoritative sources, that role belonged specifically to Helios, Hyperion's son, not Apollo. Helios drove a chariot of fire across the sky each day, was worshipped independently with his own cult centers, most famously at Rhodes, home to the Colossus of Rhodes, built in his honor. Apollo's association with the sun developed much later, largely through poetic conflation and philosophical syncretism during the Hellenistic period, centuries after the earliest myths were established. That cult center on Rhodes deserves more than a passing mention, because it produced one of the genuine 7 wonders of the ancient world. Around 280 BCE, the sculptor Chariot of Lindos completed a bronze statue of Helios, roughly 33 meters tall, funded by melted-down siege equipment the Rhodians captured after successfully defending their city against a prolonged invasion. The statue stood watch over the harbor for barely 54 years before a major earthquake snapped it at the knees in 226 BCE. What happened next is almost as telling as the statue itself. An oracle reportedly warned against rebuilding it, so the broken bronze remained exactly where it fell for centuries, and ancient visitors, including Pliny the Elder, wrote about tourists marveling that they could barely wrap their arms around one of its fallen fingers. According to a much later account, written centuries afterward and of genuinely debated historical reliability, the remains were eventually sold as scrap metal following an Arab conquest of the region in the 7th century CE, supposedly requiring an entire caravan of camels to haul away. Whether or not that specific detail is accurate, the broader pattern holds. A monument to Hyperion's own son ended up spending far longer as ruins on the ground than it ever spent standing upright. The idea still hasn't fully let go of the modern world either. In the 2000s, a group of European architects and engineers publicly proposed rebuilding a new Colossus on Rhodes as a modern landmark, taller than the original and equipped with an internal museum and observation deck, a proposal that generated real international attention, even though it was never actually built. Adding to the confusion, Homer himself sometimes used Hyperion as an epithet or alternate name for Helios directly, rather than clearly distinguishing father from son. Ancient audiences apparently found this ambiguity unremarkable, since both figures represented essentially the same underlying concept. But it's part of why, thousands of years later, Hyperion and Helios, and eventually Apollo, all became blurred together in popular memory as a single sun god figure when they were originally three genuinely distinct beings across two different generations. That naming confusion aside, Helios earns a real narrative role of his own in at least one major myth beyond his father's shadow. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, when Persephone is dragged into the underworld by Hades and her mother searches the earth in grief and fury, it's Helios who eventually tells Demeter the truth, because as the sun crossing the sky every single day, he's described as the one god who genuinely sees and hears everything that happens on earth, with nothing able to hide from him for long. It's a detail that reframes the entire sun god role as something closer to a cosmic witness than a combat deity, a function that traces directly back to Hyperion's own domain of pure, all-encompassing light passed down one generation. Selene, goddess of the moon, carries the most famous individual myth of Hyperion's three children after Helios himself. According to the most widely told version, Selene fell in love with a beautiful mortal shepherd named Endymion and, unwilling to watch him age and die the way every other mortal did, asked Zeus to grant him eternal sleep instead, frozen permanently at the peak of his youth in a cave on Mount Latmus, never aging, never waking, but never dying either. Every night, Selene was said to descend from the sky to visit him as he slept, which ancient sources sometimes used to poetically explain the moon's own irregular path and changing phases, as if her nightly detour to Endymion's cave subtly bent her route across the sky. It's a strange trade by modern standards, sacrificing a mortal's entire waking life in exchange for beauty preserved forever. But it gave Hyperion's daughter a story with genuine emotional stakes that neither of her siblings quite received in the surviving sources. Hyperion's daughter Eos, goddess of the dawn, carries her own distinct mythology worth noting. She was said to open the gates of heaven each morning to allow her brother Helios to begin his daily journey across the sky, making the entire family's mythology function almost like a coordinated daily mechanism. Dawn opening the way, the sun crossing, and by implication, some equivalent process, allowing Selene's moon to follow after dark. Helios's own bloodline produced one of the most dramatic single myths connected to this entire family, even though it centers on a grandson rather than Hyperion himself. According to Ovid, Helios had a mortal son named Phaethon, who begged his father for one favor to prove his divine parentage to a skeptical world: a single day driving the sun chariot across the sky. Helios reluctantly agreed, and the results were catastrophic. Phaethon couldn't control the divine horses, veering so wildly off course that he scorched the earth below, boiling rivers dry and threatening to burn the entire world. Zeus, left with no other option, struck the runaway chariot down with a thunderbolt, and Phaethon fell burning into the river Eridanus. His grieving sisters, the Heliades, wept over his grave so long and so completely that the gods transformed them into poplar trees, their tears hardening into amber. A detail with its own linguistic afterlife, since the ancient Greek word for amber, electron, shares its root with elector, a Homeric epithet for the sun's own brilliance, meaning the modern word electricity traces back through a fairly direct chain to this exact family's radiance. The name outlived the myth in genuinely unexpected directions. Astronomers named the asteroid 3,200 Phaethon after him specifically because its orbit swings unusually close to the sun, and the debris it sheds along that path is what produces the Geminid meteor shower every December, meaning a myth about a reckless joyride too close to the sun quite literally became the namesake for an object that behaves exactly the same way. Unlike his more well-documented siblings, Hyperion's specific role and fate during the Titanomachy receives relatively little direct attention in surviving ancient sources. Most classical accounts assume he sided with Kronos and the other Titans against Zeus, as most of his generation did, and share in their general defeat. though few sources describe his individual capture or punishment in the same specific detail given to figures like Atlas or Kronos himself. That relative thinness is itself worth noting as a pattern across this entire Titans season. Some Titans like Kronos, Prometheus, or Rhea generated rich, detailed individual mythology because ancient storytellers needed dramatic figures to explain specific conflicts or moral lessons. Others, like Hyperion, functioned more as foundational, structural concepts necessary for the cosmology to make sense, but never quite developed into full narrative characters in their own right, precisely because their domain was more abstract than personal. Much of what we know about Hyperion comes from Hesiod's Theogony, which establishes his parentage and his children, and scattered references throughout Homer's epics, where the naming overlap with Helios originates. The Homeric hymn to Demeter supplies Helios's role as cosmic witness. The Selene Endymion myth survives in fullest form through later poets like Apollonius of Rhodes, and Ovid's Metamorphoses, centuries later, provides the fullest surviving account of Phaethon's fall, folding a Roman poet's dramatic sensibilities onto a bloodline that began with a Greek Titan whose own myths were never given nearly that much narrative attention. Hyperion's name has carried forward into modern usage in ways that echo his original domain more directly than almost any other Titan's legacy this season. One of Saturn's moons, discovered in 1848, was named Hyperion, and it turned out to be a genuinely strange match for its namesake. Irregularly shaped, riddled with deep craters that give it a sponge-like appearance, and almost uniquely among moons in the solar system, tumbling through its orbit in a truly chaotic rotation that scientists still can't precisely predict more than a few weeks in advance. Centuries earlier, the English poet John Keats had already been drawn to the same name for very different reasons, beginning an ambitious epic poem titled Hyperion, centered on the fall of the Titans and the painful process of an older, more abstract order being replaced by something newer and more defined. Keats never finished it, abandoned a second attempt titled The Fall of Hyperion, a dream as well, and yet both fragments are still counted among his major works. An unfinished poem about an unfinished figure, appropriately enough. The name has kept resurfacing since. Science fiction author Dan Simmons titled an entire acclaimed novel series, The Hyperion Cantos, explicitly drawing on Keats's unfinished poem, and the same theme of an old order collapsing in the face of something it can't fully comprehend. Hyperion's legacy is quieter and more foundational than nearly any other figure we've covered this season. Not because his story lacks importance, but because his entire domain was the light that makes every other story visible in the first place. He fathered the sun, the moon, and the dawn, watched his own name get absorbed into his son's identity, and eventually faded into the same general defeat that claimed most of his generation, leaving behind less a personal legend and more a permanent, structural piece of how the ancient world understood the sky above it. Even now, every sunrise, every full moon, and every meteor shower streaking overhead in December is quietly still operating on a family structure a Titan named Hyperion put in place before he ever had a real story of his own. That's 7 Titans covered this season. One more, Mnemosyne, goddess of memory, and fittingly, the reason any of these stories survived long enough for us to tell them at all. And then this arc comes to a close. Subscribe so you don't miss it.